Okay, it looks like things are starting to tail off. So good morning, good afternoon, everybody. Maybe a couple more. That's good. I think, Henry, Paulina, we are good to go. So good morning, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. A warm welcome to you all. My name is David Hodgson and I lead the commercial team here at Themis. Today's session focuses really on the ongoing conflict across the Middle East, and it's a situation that's close to home for many of us. I'm based in the UAE, based out of Abu Dhabi. I was personally born here, and like many, I've experienced periods of uncertainty in the region before, and it brings a real perspective to the importance of what we're discussing and what Henry's going to take us through today. And I'm joined by my colleagues from across the UAE, KSA, Bahrain, and also the UK. And while the situation on the ground is very fluid, it's very much business as usual for us all. And that's a reflection really of the strong regional leadership that we have here. Clear focus on keeping us all safe. So very much Themis is open for business across the GCC, in particular the UAE, KSA, and Bahrain, where we have our offices. Now, for those that don't know, at Themis, we sit in a really unique position. First and foremost, we're a financial crime platform, and we ingest large amounts of data that fuels our AI-driven platform to help you screen, monitor, investigate your customers, third-party suppliers, investors, etc. And that becomes really powerful, even more so when you combine it with human-led intelligence that enables you really for Themis to support you in your end-to-end decision making. For many of you, that's pre and post deal, where we're helping organizations in many sectors understand exposure, assess risk, and make risk decisions with a lot of confidence. Today is really about understanding what's actually changing, what's happening on the ground, and also some of the practical steps that we should all be taking right now. I know we're working with a lot of you, and I'm delighted to hand over to our head of investigations, Henry Williams, who's going to take us through some really important topics. So, Henry, over to you, sir.
Good afternoon and good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for joining, and thanks so much for that introduction, David. So yeah, I think what we're understanding at the moment is we're dealing with an incredibly fluid situation. But I think the central theme I want to make of this talk is that the model for tackling financial crime is a public-private partnership. The public sector has finite resources, and the private sector can really help scale up those resources. And I'd say in a crisis like this actually becomes a hugely important time when compliance actually becomes an issue of national security, and not merely a case of regulatory or reputational risk. So we've been covering the Iran crisis for quite some time. So since its launch, we've been providing weekly threat assessments and briefing notes covering some of the major financial crime risks we're seeing in the region. Notably, we've been looking at cybercrime, the risk of cyber retaliation by Iran. We've been looking at the various sanctions regimes. We're shortly to release a note on money laundering as well. So all of these things are now becoming much more, without being too hyperbolic, almost becoming much more existential as we face this crisis. And the reason is because Iran at the moment is still firing missiles, it's still firing drones, and it needs money and materials to replenish its stocks. So almost whatever happens, if there is a settled agreement, these sanction evasion networks that Iran has been running for the last 50 years are going to become all the more important as it seeks to rebuild, when at the moment the most likely outcome seems to be an inconclusive ceasefire. But given how in flux the geopolitical situation is at the moment, we wouldn't be in a position of wanting to make any predictions, but that certainly is where we're seeing things headed at the moment. So a look at the history of Iranian sanctions. So these have been in place for nearly 50 years, and they were first launched by the United States in 1979 after the Iranian Revolution and a seizure of US embassy staff. And I think it's important to understand that these have been very strongly driven by the United States. Latterly, it's much more focused on stopping Iran from acquiring nuclear weapons and weapons of mass destruction. And it's become a very much an international regime, but it certainly is US-led. And as we explained in some of our briefing notes, which we'd be happy to share after this call, there are varying regimes across the different sanctions countries. So whereas the United States has a uniquely strong sanctions regime, the EU has something called a snapback mechanism, and that is where it relaunches sanctions after Iran was found to be in breach of its nuclear obligations. The United Nations also has a sanctions program. This is complicated though by the UN Security Council, where China and Russia have differing views on how Iranian sanctions should work. So we chiefly think we're looking at the US sanctions and some of the EU ones. Now, the reason we need to understand this is because if we're saying it's not just a regulatory risk, but actually a national security risk, we need to be having a whole of approach to understanding the Iranian sanctions and how we can best help stop them from evading. So the Iranian counter-sanctions network have been going for the last 50 years. It's become very sophisticated, and it relies on legitimate front companies and non-sanctioned individuals operating in global financial centers, which is why it becomes such a risk for financial crime practitioners. And so what I'd like to do now is have a look at one of the front companies we've seen and understand a bit more about what that actually means and seeing how these Iranian sanction networks operate in practice. So here we have the Ascotec Group. So this is a German company which has been in place since 1990. Now, Ascotec Group looks and acts like a seemingly legitimate company. It helps support mining and mining technology, but also it's not too subtle about how it works. If you look at its mission and vision, it's the development and transfer of know-how and technology to Iran and between Iran. And its vision is to be one of the leading companies in the transfer of know-how. So what we'd argue here is that Ascotec is a prime example of a seemingly legitimate company sharing industrial understanding with Iran and actually helping Iran to access goods which are subject to sanctions. And what we understood from actually looking at the company was that Ascotec, despite its seeming appearance, is not too far removed from actually the Iranian leadership. And how we can understand that is if we go and look at a Themis search map. And I think what I need to just explain before we go into this is that when we're looking at sanctions evasion networks, they are networks. And what we have to understand is when we're dealing with something which is high risk, that we look at the entire parties, we look at the directors, the previous directors, the owners, understanding beneficial ownership information. All of these things combine to build that real network. And with it, it helps us to understand if there's a sanction risk here. I should also point out that Ascotec's a great example of the differing sanctions between the US and the EU. So Ascotec is sanctioned by the United States. They have realized its ties to the Iranian regime, and it's been consistently sanctioned for the last 20 years. And it's been highlighted by Iranian opposition groups as a company which has been involved in trade with Iran. But the EU is yet to sanction Ascotec. The snapback sanctions when Iran was found to be in breach of its nuclear program haven't been fully comprehensive. And so Ascotec currently is only sanctioned by the United States, not by the EU or by the UN. Now, if I go and explain to you about this network map, here's an example from a Themis search map we've done previously to explain how Ascotec Holding can, and its ties to the Iranian regime. So if we look in the middle, we see Ascotec Holding. And then if you follow the line up to 11 o'clock, we can see Ascotec Steel Trading. And the key figure we need to look at is Abdul Hadi Tabibi. And again, I think this is a great example because Abdul Hadi Tabibi is not a sanctioned individual. He's not a known individual, but he has appeared in adverse media around Iranian money laundering networks. Notably, he set up a company called Mir Trade Limited in the United Arab Emirates in Ras Al Khaimah, which again shows the risk that global financial centers face from Iranian sanctions networks. Abdul Hadi Tabibi is also the owner of another German company, GIC International GmbH. This company is itself controlled by Garda Investment Company. Now, we can see here the red circles around Garda Investment Company and GIC International both show that they are on US sanctions, but again, they're not on EU sanctions. And finally, we can also look, when we're looking at the connection with the Supreme Leader. So EIKO is the execution of Imam Khomeini's order, which is a company which reports directly to the Ayatollah. And this manages a huge number of investments across Iran. It's not subject to any Iranian parliamentary scrutiny. It's solely in command of the Ayatollah. So we can see immediately that the Supreme Leader has direct control of Garda Investment Company, which again controls GIC International. And this tells us that Abdul Hadi Tabibi, even though he is not a sanctioned individual, has extremely close ties to Iranian leadership. And the fact that he is a former signatory for an Ascotec subsidiary shows how central to the Iranian leadership Ascotec is. And I just want to have a look at some of the other characters we see here. Another former director of Ascotec Holding is Bahram Sabani. Now, he is the former chief financial officer of Mobarake Steel Company. Again, these are both, and Tara Steel Trading GmbH, these are both sanctioned companies due to their ownership by the Iranian government. Tara Steel Trading is even more interesting because Farhad Dinat Salat Gilani is being flagged by German intelligence as an Iranian intelligence officer. So we can see just through network mapping that despite Ascotec Holding not being on EU sanctions or UN sanctions, and while it is being picked up by the aggressive US sanctions, even people within that network aren't captured. And it's so important to screen against adverse media and look at the wider network map to see if there's any risk involved in these individuals or companies. Now, finally, I'd like to look at Ascotec Mineral and Machinery GmbH. Again, this is a very interesting case, and I think sort of illustrates some of the technology transfer we're seeing between Germany and Iran, between companies operating in global financial centers in Iran and operating in the West. So when we look at washing machines and financial crime, we tend to think of money laundering, but actually nuclear proliferation and proliferation of weapons are hugely important. So what we understand with washing machines is that following the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, the numbers of refrigerators and washing machines going to countries such as Kazakhstan shot through the roof. And the reason for this is that washing machines and refrigerators have microchips, which can also have a dual use purpose and be used in drones. So Ascotec Mineral and Machinery has also been understood to be sending lots of refrigerators and washing machines. And we understood this by looking at trade data. And the trade data actually found that Ascotec Mineral Mining was operating an HS code 842199, which is involved in centrifuges, not nuclear centrifuges, but typically it's one associated with washing machines and refrigerators. Given the risk of this particular subset, that HS code is actually subject to higher scrutiny because of it. And therefore, if you're dealing in trade finance and you see this HS code, it's a clear risk that some of the drones that Iran are building are potentially being sourced, and the chips are potentially being sourced through this. And we can see this very clearly here. This is a photograph of a Russian paratrooper. He's very pleased with himself because he's got his own fridge. And the fridge here is also obviously providing microchips, which are going to help support the invasion of Ukraine. And I'd argue that Ascotec Mineral Mining's delivery of similar products to Iran, as shown by trade data, is again a huge example of some of the risks. Now, it could generally have been sending washing machines to Iran, but it does beg the question why a mining company is delivering washing machines all of a sudden. So in conclusion, what we need to understand is that when it comes to Iran, financial crime, it's not a regulatory reputational risk. It's not the bare minimum you need to do because of jurisdiction you operate in. It goes right to national security now. Iran is trying to replenish its weapons stocks. It's going to be relying on its sanctions evasion networks to do this. And there are ways to observe this happening if you look at network maps and if you do the relevant due diligence when you come across high-risk counterparties. So I think given the divergence between the US and the EU and the sanctions regime, it's always important to screen across multiple lists. And I'm sure my colleagues David and Paulina will be able to help explain how Themis can help do some of this. We also need to understand that network analysis is how you identify connections of concern. And this is hugely important because Iran uses seemingly innocent front companies and people who've potentially got no track record. So it's the wider network you need to understand to be able to see if there's any issues of concern. And going back to what I said at the beginning, we all have a role to play here. The public sector can only do so much, and actually the private sector needs to really help support stopping the Iranian regime from continuing to fire rockets. And this can be done by good screening, by good due diligence. And we also need to understand that while the US Treasury is a very good guide, the OFAC sanctions are probably the strongest. We also need to look at our own ways. We need to look at things such as adverse media, network mapping. These are the things which will help pick up information which is still yet to be picked up by governments who are watching this space. So I hope that's a good sort of roundup of where we are in terms of Iranian sanctions. And I'll hand over to my colleagues David and Paulina now, but we'd be very happy to answer any questions which these might have raised.
Yeah, I think just Paulina, it's worth just pausing there for a second. Does anybody across the audience have any questions specifically for Henry there? Looks not at this stage. Paulina, over to you.
Yeah, thank you, David. Hi, everyone, and thank you again for joining. So for those of you that don't know me, I'm Paulina Salewska. I work with many of you on a call today on various exciting use cases and projects, and I'm based in the UAE in Abu Dhabi. So we've been working closely with organizations across the UK and Middle East, and of course, even more closely lately. Many already have solutions in place, but we are seeing more and more requests to run independent projects to ensure your organization is watertight. Now, this is being driven by increasing expectations around continuous screening, ownership transparency, and sanctions exposure. And across the jurisdictions that you're operating in, this is where the risk sits, particularly with growing regulatory scrutiny and potential financial and reputational impact, which includes incredible fines as well. So we've put together a couple of focus packages to help you assess your current position, identify any gaps, and ensure that you're fully covered. So please do feel free to reach out after the webinar if you'd like to discuss further. But in the meantime, I'll pass over back to Henry to filter through some of the questions.
Thanks, Paulina. Henry, we had one come through from Josh around how come the German entity is still operating in Germany when there are such clear sanction issues? Please also, before Henry answers that, there is a Q&A section. If anybody wishes to put a question, please pop it in there and we'll get them answered. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Josh. I think there's a couple of things there. I think one is scale. I think the public sector has finite resources. It can't examine every sanctions case at the speed potentially needed for it. So I think obviously the US has flagged it. What's happened is after the US relaunched sanctions on Iran when it was found under the first Trump administration, when it found that Iran was in breach of its nuclear obligations, the EU also called something called a snapback mechanism, which meant that would allow it to have its own sanctions re-implemented on Iran. But there's a gap between what was done originally in the first sanctions phase. Those were then relieved in the mid 2010s, and now they've come back on again. But there's still a gap between what was originally sanctioned and what has been sanctioned under the snapback mechanism. But I'd argue that it's such a clear case here. We also have to understand that Germany is one of Iran's largest trading partners. So all these companies based in Dusseldorf, they have big skin in the game that they want to sort of keep the situation as it is. And that's probably kind of worked until the last 3 weeks, when now the reality of the war is hitting home. And I'd certainly hope to see escalate sanctioned sooner rather than later. But again, it's just a case of when the EU actually gets to it, I'd suggest.
Thanks, Henry. We've had a couple more come through. One, I think that's probably on everybody's mind. When will the Strait of Hormuz reopen? Could it be an icebreaker? When will the Strait of Hormuz reopen, Henry?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's in the lap of Donald Trump and the new Iranian leadership, and both I'd say are intensely unpredictable. From an outside observation, the Strait of Hormuz is Iran's leverage. So while the war's going on, it's never going to give it up. It would take quite a huge operation by the US to either guide ships through the straits or to actually prevent Iran from having any form of control, because it takes just one ship to be attacked for it all to have to be closed down again. So I think it will come from it's either going to come from a negotiated settlement, or the US will increase its attacks on Iran and that way. But it's not happening in the foreseeable future unless the parties can come to terms, I think.
Yeah, thank you very much, Henry. Some interesting ones that are coming through. We're getting quite a lot around the topic of AI. What's your view, Henry, on the potential impact that the conflict's having on artificial intelligence overall, and how companies are adopting that?
Yeah, I think there's a few things. I think the network mapping and the way that network maps can identify, what technically known as clean skins, as in people who are associated with bad parties, but who haven't actually got a reputation themselves. I think AI is hugely helpful for understanding those networks and understanding those at scale. And that can be the same looking at trade data, looking at HS codes, but also looking at network maps. So looking at those directors, beneficial ownerships, it allows you to do that very quickly. And again, I think, it's less AI, it's more large language models, but the way that can be used to screen across adverse media, and particularly across multiple languages very quickly. Again, I think it's not just sanctions lists which are telling us that these networks exist, it's also adverse media, which is really helpful. So I think AI is obviously hugely important for that. Now, in terms of future of AI, we've obviously seen that data centers have been one primary target of the Iranian regime. So there is that to contend with, as well as spiraling energy costs. But I think AI is here to stay, and what we have to do is utilize it to really help defeat this problem at scale.
Yeah, thank you very much, Henry. There's a few linking to really fundraising activities from quite a few people around what we're seeing the IRGC doing in terms of fundraising overall. What are your thoughts there?
Yeah, I think again this is something we see quite a lot of, which is this whole of country approach to financial crime. So Iran's been put in this position for the last 50 years by the US sanctions. It's been very much cut off from international finance, particularly transacting in US dollars. And the IRGC is a huge part of that. And any funds which can get linked to that are very quickly sanctioned. So I think often when we're looking at corruption across the world, when we're looking at money laundering, they're very much down to individual acts of greed. So it'll be criminal networks seeking to make money, it'll be political officials seeking something on the side. That's less the case with Iran. What we have in Iran is much more around, we will as a whole of country approach, and it will use legitimate businesses. And what we have to remember is these businesses will point to their bottom line and say, actually, we're doing a lot of legitimate activities. But I would say when you have individuals who are so closely connected to entities controlled by the Ayatollah or who are Iranian politically exposed persons, there's no real way that cannot be linked to the Iranian government and lent on by the Iranian government. And certainly here, I'm based in the UK. What we've seen very recently is one Iranian official with a multi-million-pound property portfolio. And that's not because he likes living the life of luxury in London. It's much more a money laundering tactic. And I think that's something, again, we have to be very aware of. And that can clearly be linked back to organizations such as the IRGC.
Yeah, absolutely. There's one just come through back on the German entity, and I'll come to that, Henry. But there's been a few around from companies, I think from one from a DNFPB around, they've already got processes in place to monitor their current list of customers to make sure they're protecting themselves. But Paulina, are there other things that organizations can do to make sure that they're truly watertight?
Absolutely. I think first and foremost, it's really important that all of the client, investor, supplier and vendor portfolio is monitored on an ongoing basis. And very often, we always think that we're set up correctly, but in an event like what has recently happened across the region, it's really important that that is reviewed thoroughly, and hence why we were here to support as well, to make sure that we can help in the portfolio immediately, just to make sure that there are no hidden risks and threats. And very often, if something's not monitored correctly, it can very easily slip through the cracks. We do also have a general guide on how we can best support DNFPBs, but also financial institutions. And of course, it's very much region dependent. So I'm always happy to talk about it in more detail offline.
Yeah, thanks. I think that the consequence, something slipping through the net's really clear. I think it's a clear call to action. Our recommendation at Themis is that that you run a standalone project in parallel to your robust operating systems that you have in place, and we're more than happy to support you there. Henry, coming back to the German entity, really pertinent question. How's it still operating when there are such clear sanction issues?
Yeah, well, I think this is we went through this slightly earlier, but I think there's a few things going on there, and I think there's clearly the interest in the sort of German industrial base in not upsetting a profitable sector for it, and I'd say there's a failure on the EU snapback mechanism to really check out the risks, and I think this really comes back to what I talk about when you can't just look at your own personal regulatory risk. If you're an EU operating company, you might only be subject to the EU sanctions lists, and therefore Ascotex are a totally fine company to trade with. But I would say when we're seeing a much more existential threat from Iranian sanctions evasion networks, we need to be much more on top of it, and that means also screening against others such as the US. And very clearly, if you look at Ascotec in the US sanctions list, it's there, and and it goes through a lot of the company's subsidiaries to really help you understand how not to get caught up in that. And we're seeing that Ascotec's not the only German company involved here. There's numerous companies we're seeing in Dusseldorf. And I think this is just something to point out. We're seeing Iranian money laundering in UK property and German property through German front companies. We're seeing trading companies in the UAE as a way to launder the destination of high-risk goods. And certainly, I think that's something we come across quite regularly, is falsified bills of lading, where they will say one destination, and then either it will stop there briefly before moving on to Iran, or it will just go straight to Iran. We've seen numerous investigations in the press about how this operates. And that's going down to ships turning off their transponders, which again brings us back to the point that the media has a hugely important part to play in tackling this problem, because Iran is under such scrutiny. I'd say even if it's not appearing on a US sanctions list, being able to understand the wider threat, and we see this across financial crime as a whole. If you understand the wider threat, if you're well informed of the wider threat, you can spot yourself things which don't add up, or you can just see a link. Okay, it's a sanctioned HS code. It's coming from a country like Turkey, which has got less qualms about trading with Iran. It's stopping in the UAE, but the UAE company it's going to doesn't seem to have any activities. All of those things for me would be like, okay, well, is this potentially a bit of smuggling going on here? So you need to have that sort of whole of financial crime approach to tackling this problem.
Absolutely, and just to everybody on the call, we've still got a lot of participants. Please do keep the questions coming in. There's a lot of very interesting ones. I mean, Henry, I think the big topic of conversation is probably movement in the last 24 hours. And how do you and how do we at Themis see the risk landscape shifting if the conflict broadens regionally? What are the early indicators that businesses need to be monitoring right now? How do they get ahead here?
Yeah, I'd say it comes back to the key point. I think Iran will need to rebuild, and if it is an inconclusive ceasefire with a hostile Iranian regime, it will return to its old sanctions evasion networks to do those. Those sanction evasion networks are visible if you look in the correct manner. So if you do the network analysis, you screen against sanctions lists, multiple sanctions lists, and if you look across to the adverse media, I'd say those three things are absolutely key to really understanding the Iranian threat. We have to obviously deal with various scenarios which could happen. But I think an inconclusive peace with a still hostile Iranian regime certainly seems like the most likely at this stage. Now, across the region where you are, David, that's going to have different implications. But certainly, I think what we need to have better data on is beneficial ownership data. I think where companies are able to set up anonymously, that's a huge risk, because it prevents us from understanding who are the ultimate controlling parties. So we're lucky that we can understand a German network because Germany has good disclosure on directors and beneficiaries. Other jurisdictions don't. And if we don't have that data, and again, it has to be civil society, it has to be the private sector, journalists, NGOs being able to see it. It can't just be the public sector, it can't just be law enforcement. There needs to be that wider view of beneficial ownership and director data. And those secrecy jurisdictions are going to be very useful to Iran in rebuilding its networks until they can be potentially unlocked. And it's not just companies as well. I think we see one of the clear things is money laundering through property. Certainly that's something we see in the UK. The UK has had a historically long problem of money laundering in its property sector. I'd say one way that's got a lot better is the public ownership register of any companies owned by an offshore company. Now, that can be more often honoured in the breach than the observance. So nominee owners are put in there, or people actually just fail to do it and rather just pay the fine. But all of those things are themselves a red flag. If you've got someone who's got no business owning a huge property portfolio, that's a red flag. If you've got a property portfolio which has failed to register its owner, that's a red flag. So again, I think those public beneficial ownership data points are hugely useful. And obviously, as an AI business, we can use those and we can start crawling those, and again start piecing together those kind of data points. So yeah, I think there's a lot we need to be looking at, and I think different jurisdictions are going to need to up their game a bit in terms of supporting this.
Yeah, absolutely, Henry. You raise a really good point. We've had a couple of questions actually coming in from the UK financial sector, a couple of UK-based banks on the call, and they really want to know how they should be approaching the ongoing screening of existing customers and counterparties for sanctions exposure, where what you've just been talking around about ownership structures being really complex and jurisdictional risk has changed since the relationship was onboarded. How should they be looking at this as a larger entity and organization?
Yeah, thanks, David. I think that's a really important question. I think there's a couple of points I'd make. I think what we saw in the escalate example, I think was very interesting, was that nominees weren't really used. The people involved are always one or two steps away from Iranian officials you could pick up. And that's just to me a modus operandi where the Iranian sanctions evasion networks would rather have trusted people in charge rather than nominees. That might change, but I think certainly that's something we need to be looking at from a screening point of view. I also think in terms of ongoing monitoring, yes, maybe Avtotech will be sanctioned in the next week or two. And so what you need to do is have the alert system, which will immediately notify you when that happens, because it might not be a company like that. It might be another client you have which suddenly gets flagged in an adverse media article. And again, if you have a monitoring solution which scans for adverse media, particularly across financial crime risk, as well as scanning PEP lists and sanctions lists, that's really going to help you to understand if you're facing new risks. I think particularly again in this very changed environment.
Yeah, thank you so much, Henry. Really appreciate it. We've had a couple come in from the UAE specifically around the consequence here. Polina, what are the potential fines that we're looking at for a company based in Al Ain, for example, if they're dealing with a pet from Iran at the moment? What are the type of things that are being imposed?
So from a UAE perspective, the failure to implement controls can lead to severe penalties, and that includes a financial fine that could exceed 5 million dirhams. It could also include closure of business premises, and then potential deportation of non-national managers as well. So the fines are actually very significant when it comes to that.
Yeah, it's significant, and it's something that shouldn't be overlooked at all. I know we've asked a lot of questions at the moment, so I think we've got still a few more that are trickling and coming in, which I'm sure Henry will be happy to answer. I think there's been a couple around. Will we ever live in a world, Henry, where Iran's been sanctioned for around 50 years? Are we going to ever live in a world, do you think, whereby these sanctions are lifted overall? I mean, it's quite a broad question to ask, but I think one that's on the tip of many people's tongues.
No, absolutely. I mean, and that's a potential outcome of the situation we're in. So essentially, the sanctions regime has been war by other means on Iran, led, I'd argue, by the United States since the Iranian Revolution in 1979. If there's a regime in Iran which is suddenly more friendly to the United States, then there's no need to have a sanctions regime anymore. And so certainly that's potentially one outcome of the scenario we're in, where a new government is formed in Iran. The US has good relations with it. And, if you think other Security Council members, China and Russia, already have good relationships with the existing Iranian government, then there becomes much less need for that. And I'd say that's across the whole sanctions board. Essentially, sanctions is that tool people reach for before taking things to a much more sort of kinetic level. And so essentially when we can be in an environment where countries are able to get along and aren't continually antagonizing each other, then there's much less need for sanctions.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Henry. And maybe in line with the example of the German company and the chips and washing machines, we've got a few questions coming in from Bahrain, but we're hearing a lot about corporate concealment across the region. Very similar use case. But could you explain for the new joiners, what does corporate concealment really mean? What does it involve, and what are the risks, Henry?
Yeah, sure. I think we have corporate concealment can come across lots of different ways. It can be nominee owners of a company. It can be fake bills of lading on a trade. It can be across many different areas. And again, I think when we go back to the washing machine example, it can be something seemingly legitimate, which then actually becomes much more dangerous when it's used in the wrong hands. And that's what we talk about when we talk about dual-use goods. So dual-use goods are, fertilizer is a dual-use good. Fertilizer is obviously important for farming, but it's also a key component for making bombs. So various products have restrictions on them because of the capacity they have for wrongdoing as well. And again, I think that's why that particular sanctions code, HS code, which I'll just say again is 842199, is so important to monitor, because we've seen a huge uptake in it in CIS countries following the Russian invasion of Ukraine. That immediately got flagged by the United States OFAC. They spotted what was potentially going on there. And so again, I think we always have to monitor dual-use goods. That's a really clear way you can help prevent proliferation financing, is by understanding, is this a dual-use good? If so, will I subject the company I'm dealing with to heightened due diligence? And so I can understand, therefore, is this potentially actually a front for a seeming more nasty kind of trade?
Yeah, thank you very much, Henry. Paulina, would you have anything else to add to that at all, specifically on corporate concealment and what we're seeing across the region?
Yes, so we have seen examples where sanctioned entities or people are opening new businesses in the Gulf states and putting local CEOs and directors. So from the outside of it, the actual businesses look fairly legitimate, dressed in local robes, so to speak. But actually, if you look deeper and into the background of them, there's a lot of financial crime risk exposure. So the business that wants to present itself as a, potentially a Bahraini, UAE-based, Saudi-based business is actually in a background has got exposure to financial crime compliance complications and, of course, sanctions issues that we're discussing right now. So the more that we can do to prevent those types of companies trading in the world as a alleged entity as opposed to an Iranian one, the better, of course.
Thank you very much on that, Polina. I think we can take a couple more that are coming through. Henry, Polina, I mean, probably one for you to start off with, Henry. We're saying, and what we've spoken about today is that Iran are potentially using complex web of proxy networks to launder money, right? How are businesses supposed to know that? They're doing due diligence already. They have robust programs. Are we saying that these organizations across multiple sectors need to go deeper? And if so, how do they do that?
Yeah, I think it needs to be systematic. I think always with the approach, if you're systematic about it, then it's much more difficult to fall in between the cracks. So I think the first thing is you conduct your risk assessment, you look at your clients, you understand which are higher risk, and you base that around your own risk framework. So, are they trading from countries which should be known to launder proceeds going into Iran? Have they appeared on another sanctions list? Are they owned by a PEP? Those kind of risk frameworks. And then from that, you can say, okay, well, these 10% of my customers fit into that bucket. So what level of due diligence, therefore, will I do to them? And that can be anything from sort of straightforward screening using an AI-powered platform, for instance, which is gathering adverse media and litigation and network parties, or it can be enhanced due diligence, which is what my role is at Themis, is to deal with those very, very high risk clients, to sort of really look into them and understand, okay, is this actually something more dangerous than we first thought? But it comes back to your risk framework. And then once you identify the high risk parties in your risk framework, you then subject them to the level of due diligence you think is necessary to give you peace of mind. And I think always what you need to be doing is auditing the work you're doing. Because if you can show you're using best practice, sanctions evasion network are good. They're designed to be good. They're supporting the Iranian government. So you won't catch everything. But if you can institute best practice, you'll catch a lot. And I think that's something which is always really important to be able to demonstrate to regulators.
Yeah, I fully agree, Henry. And look, in short form, what we're saying here is that if there's anybody on this call or in your wider network that are concerned about any risk and due diligence across this, Themis and the Themis team across all locations can help you. We support with both our technology, but also uniquely with the human investigative layer that's led by Henry and his team. We're seeing a lot in the market where we're putting packages together to support standalone projects side by side against your current robust processes. But Polina, maybe a quick one for you specifically on our technology. How are you supporting probably quite a few people on this call already in some of the calls to action at the moment?
Absolutely. So I think from the technology standpoint, what was really important to us is ensure that we have a solution that is fit for purpose to all types and sizes of organizations, especially when times like these. So there are the standard protocols that need to be followed. So of course, from platform perspective, we support with ongoing monitoring of all the clients, vendors, and suppliers to make sure that if there are any changes within their profile or their activity, we can notify our clients immediately. On the back of it as well, we support with automated risk analysis and calculation just to make sure that you know exactly where your portfolio fits, from anything from low, medium to high risk. And then we utilize our AI to bring all of the multi-millions data sets together to ensure that the profiles that you're looking at are correct profiles. Any entity or individuals that our clients are screening are not connected directly or indirectly through any potential links to sanctioned counterparties, or in similar instances like we've seen today, to Iranian-owned assets. And most importantly, with the support of the team of experts, both from just standard compliance and financial crime compliance in general, we can ensure that all of the results are read and acted upon in the right way. But we're scalable and supporting the best that we can in any circumstance, including this one.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think we'll take the final question around, what are the best practices that smaller DNFPBs can use to reconcile differences between the UK, EU, UN and local sanctions regimes that are resource constrained? Paulina, Henry, probably one for both of you there.
Paulina, I'll let you take this if you like. Hello, can you hear me?
Paulina's on mute.
Oh.
Yeah, apologies. Just had a slight internet challenge. Sorry, David, can you just repeat that question again?
Yeah, so, at Themis, we support both larger financial institutions, multiple sectors, multiple companies, but we've had a couple of questions around smaller DNFPBs and how we can support them to reconcile differences between kind of UK, EU, UN and local sanctions regimes. These companies are highly resource constrained. They don't have resources that potentially a bank might have or a larger financial institution. How are we helping them? Because I know we help them a lot.
Of course. So this is where really where the support for our technology, but also our expertise comes in. So for any organizations that have got time constraint, we first of all can help with the sanction jurisdictional risk. So we can really help in evaluating any changes, particularly in the current landscape, in the Iranian sanctions landscape, any key risks that their firms should focus on, and any regulatory expectations and compliance obligations that Henry has spoken about before. But most importantly, we can take the stress away of having to enable the continuous monitoring of clients and counterparties. We can actually take that stress and do that on behalf of our clients, provide them with real-time alerts on sanctions and emerging risk indications, and most importantly, provide a dedicated analyst support for escalation and oversight. And that could include external, but also looking at internally on any policies and frameworks and identifying if there are any gaps that need to be improved on an ongoing basis as the situation changes.
Brilliant. Yeah, thank you, Paulina. Really, really important stuff. I think we can start to bring this to a close now. I think before I do so, Henry, just let's come back to you for a moment. We've covered a lot, and you covered some great stories there and about what's happening immediately on the ground at the moment. But what would be your key takeaways at the moment and key thoughts for the remaining part of the audience, Hen?
Yeah, thanks, David. I think what it has to be is that Iranian sanctions isn't just a regulatory issue now, it's a national security issue. And I think particularly, a lot of our clients are based in the GCC region, which are still subject to attacks, which are being caused by a lot of these, being fueled by these sanction networks. And we're going to see Iran trying to rebuild these sanction networks and rebuild their inventory. So I think it's not just a case of worrying about reputational regulatory risk, it's a national security risk. And therefore, we really all need to up our game on it. And we can do that even, as Paulina was explained, about to DNFPBs, so even to smaller businesses. Themis was designed to help businesses tackle financial crime. Our automated solution is designed to help even the smallest business be able to conduct due diligence, whereas our intelligence team allows us to help large organizations operate in higher risk environments. So all of these things are doable, and it's something we all need to collectively work on. And I think, as I said, as the situation remains fluid, and we just have to keep on watching and keep on monitoring the situation.
Thank you very much, Henry. And Paulina, what would be the closing thoughts and comments from you?
I think from my perspective, if anyone has any questions, whether it's related to the current situation, but anything from the financial crime landscape as well, any concerns about the current actions taken internally and what the future does look like to ensure that everyone is fully covered, because of course no one would like to see financial penalties and potential business closures. Please do reach out, we can help. We've got great expertise and fantastic team behind it, anything from technology to intelligence. So do feel free to reach out to myself, to our wider team, and we'll certainly be able to support, even if just to have a quick conversation around what's currently happening.
Yeah, thank you very much, Paulina. I think some good closing comments. I think from my perspective, you know, there's the conflict overall brings quite a very, you know, very clear call to action for us all across, you know, small, medium and large enterprises in all sectors. You know, the consequence of inaction and working with companies or organizations that are trying to conceal themselves is extremely severe, and we can talk you through what those penalties are, and we can also, as Themis, we can provide you with solutions to stand alone against your current project. So, you know, we're here, my team's here to support you, and the wider Themis team across the UK, Bahrain, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, and also the UAE are here to support you. I wanted to thank everybody for their time and consideration. I know Lewis, you're going to be reaching out to Lewis and the team are going to be following up with everybody directly after this with our details, so you can clearly reach out to us. But thank you to everybody for joining. It's been an absolute pleasure. We look forward to talking with you in the very near future and in the coming days. Thanks a lot. Have a good day.
Thank you.